of the city. The Safavid Maidan also accommodated those daily performances of the life of the city that I would like to underscore. Those include cafes and marketplaces and performances of people whose magical work was on display and so on. So on the quotidien side, the large rectangular Maidans in Isfahan as the one that I'm using, but later on I will also share something of the larger sort of implications for cities in the Safavid world, in Safavid Iran, that these were fitted, designed actually, with a scattering of important urban functions, public functions. They had places of worship and learning, mosques and madrasas. They had public access or provided for public access to personal hygiene, hammams, bathhouses. They also provided for daily markets, market stalls, but also very carefully designed spaces for permanent shops along the peripheral walls of the square. There were coffee houses and places of entertainment and sociability, which were both licit and illicit indeed. The Maidans, of which a number have survived or are known from texts in the Safavid world, included, for instance, the Maidan in Qazvin, which is the upper two images, to be seen. Today, it's so transformed. It's actually a street now that we cannot quite imagine how much that Maidan in Qazvin is actually something of a model, perhaps, for the Maidan in Isfahan. In Isfahan, however, it becomes a much more complex planning urban development exercise. But in Qazvin, as well as in Isfahan, these were known before their sort of transformation, if you will, into in Qazvin into an urban space, in Isfahan as one of the centerpieces, one of the axial points of the new urban development in 1991. Before they become so, the space of public encounter, they carried the generic name of Maidan Asp, or equestrian square, or in the Ottoman context, it's At Maidane. These were in accordance with their primary function as a place where armies were mustered and for military and equestrian exercises. As it were, these kinds of spaces, Maidans, Maidan Asp, stood outside the walled medieval cities, that they become then architecturally articulated into rectangular spaces with these functions built around them into their peripheries, turns the Maidan, the old Maidan, as a concept into a center of public urban life, essentially, and gathers communities around it. Here, again, now and after they become really Maidans, as in urban centers, it's there that we find the various activities of the city taking place. This could include, for instance, polo playing. Maidan of Isfahan is measured as a standard of a polo field, and its goalposts rather are still standing. In fact, Chogan, as we know, has ancient Persian origin. It was a place for another game, mainly a compound word known as Qopok Andozi, which was a game of archery, a sort of an archery on horseback, for which a single post was raised in the center of the square. In other words, the Maidan, in its periphery, in its subsidiary or attendant buildings of great significance, was also very self-consciously developed to serve various functions. The court and the denizens of these cities, and again, I focus attention here on Isfahan's case, could watch the matches from balconies or the sides of the field, the Maidan periphery. The Safavid historian Iskandar Beg Munshi reports of this sort of attachment, if you will, of the Shahs, in particular Shah Abbas I, under whose reign the city turns into this capital city, redeveloped and so forth, that he was particularly partial to the Maidan and Naqsh Jahan, and that he considered it to be the picture gallery of the seen and the spring-like place of the unseen, sort of the material, but also immaterial, were brought into focus here in the Maidan. Sovari va Ma'navi, as they call them, or Iskandar Beg puts it. And he notes that this is where Shah Abbas and his courtiers oftentimes went out to play polo, but also to watch from the Ayvan, the sort of the viewing stage of the Ali Rapu Palace on the right-hand side, or in front of you in the camphor image, that's where one could also see the Shah and his entourage while he and his guests, foreign envoys, visitors, and dignitaries could watch what happens in the Maidan. At a reception that was given in 1611 to receive the deposed Uzbek ruler Vali Muhammad Khan in Isfahan, the Maidan, according to sources, was decked out for polo matches, but also for elaborate fireworks. Fireworks were a big deal in the Maidan of Isfahan, which also involved, as a source tells us, an elephant whose fearful reactions to all the noise was found quite entertaining by the Khan, who was sitting on that porch at the Ali Rapu Palace, that the Shah and his guests actually watched the events from that balcony in front of the palace, and then went out on into the Maidan for a stroll around and to check out the bazaars around. In other words, and at all times, we understand that the public was present, actually. Equally impressed by the social functions and urban appeal of the Maidans were the European visitors to Qazvin and Isfahan, and in particular Isfahan in the 17th century. And this is an important subject, which is another facet of my sort of ongoing, never-ending interest in the Maidan as the public space, as the center of urbanity, if you will, that the Europeans invariably talk about the Maidan in their chronicles, but also provide us with images, these engraved images, of which I'm showing you just a few here, and that this is a particular perspective they present with regards to Isfahan, but not necessarily what we see in, for instance, their views of Istanbul at this time, where Maidan is not as much of a feature of the city as we understand in Isfahan, nor was it in Mughal Delhi, for instance. The Englishman, John Cartwright, who was famed as the preacher, so many of them were in fact missionaries. He visited in 1600, 1601, so about a decade after the Maidan had been laid out, and describes the two major squares in Safavid Iran, Qazvin and Isfahan one, and says about the Qazvin one, for instance, merchant stalls and variety of goods were presented in that Maidan in Qazvin. In Isfahan, he refers to it as At Maidan, in other words, in the Turkish meaning of the hippodrome, or the Maidan Asp, if you will, that he notes is the greatest marketplace or high street of Isfahan. Round about this place are erected certain high scaffolds where the multitude sit to behold the warlike exercises performed by the king and his courtiers. You can hear him not quite getting the picture, but nonetheless, pretty impressive in what he sees. In this place, too, is to be seen, he continues, several times in the year, the pleasant sight of fireworks, of banquets, of music, of wrestling, and of whatsoever triumphs else there is to be shown for the declaration of the joy of this people. Again, that aspect is hugely important to keep in mind. Perhaps as significant is the observer's other point about the square, in which he points out the obligation towards safeguarding justice and the public performance of that. And he says the king very often in this place, in the presence of the peers of the realm, will give judgment in several causes. This is particular to Shah Abbas, who really is out in the Maidan more often than anyone else. And Europeans note this, actually, of his time. Note the fact that unlike their kings in Europe, Shah Abbas is out and about in the Maidan and the bazaar. In other words, the public nature of that space lives quite profoundly in the image that we get of the Maidan, but most importantly, must have informed its design, in fact. Even before the construction of the Maidan in Nakhsha Jahan, the performative dimension of a Maidan as an urban idea is very much underscored in the way events are told when Shah Abbas comes to Isfahan for visits before he commissions the building or rebuilding of the city and turning it into, or designating it as, the capital city, which happens in 1598. But even before, when he comes to visit, there are indications of how important the idea of the public square had been. So a royal visit takes place before the building commission comes in. And around that, the historian Afushte Natanzi tells us that the Shah received the full measure of pishbaz, that is istiqbal in Arabic, welcoming essentially, the city's welcoming events and ceremonies, which is a cultural practice quite widespread indeed and of great currency. That's not unique to the Islamic world or to the Persianate world, but certainly an important feature of the social life, in fact, in connection with the royal personage here. In this case, the urban guilds and notables of the city had put up a spectacular show, Afushte Natanzi tells us, along a route that was predetermined, and they had decorated, in other words, people of Isfahan had decorated the streets through which the Shah would pass. And each skilled craftsman and guildmaster had created, even invented, as he says, new objects of wonderment for display along the route towards this square, which was at the time not the square as we know it, but the Maidan asp, or the hippodrome of Isfahan, if you will. And people prepared to welcome the Shah. So he talks about much jubilation and fanfare when the processional began from the first gathering place just outside of the city, one of the gates, and that from an old Maidan known as Maidan Ilchi, a public square that was located near one of the major north gates into the old walled city, and that this route was carried down or followed, as Natanzi tells us, by decorations on either side and indeed performances. He adds that one clever person had built out a wood or a wooden kiosk with a platform where a camel was installed, walking and turning a grinding wheel. Having thus established the rapport between the Shah and people of Isfahan, in other words, awe-inspiring invention accompanied the Shah as he was guided from the old Maidan to the royal residence, which was on the side of the hippodrome or Maidan asp before it becomes the Maidan that we know. Evidently, a weaver had devised a mobile weaving contraption that would turn as the master weaver would turn his attention. And while the float, it was a float basically, moved along with the Shah, the weaver continued with his business, finishing at the end of the route a stretch of velvet cloth. So its performance along the way, but also coming into the Maidan from the Ilchi square, the old square, all the way to the new Maidan. In other words, as a public space in which both the ruler and the apparatus of rule and the subjects, the denizens, came to interact. We know of these floats and performances and processionals as well in Istanbul, when the hippodrome of Istanbul becomes the site for these circumcision events, which are recorded in absolutely charming images of these processionals, of guilds, for instance, that range from the guild of bathhouse workers to the guild of towel makers to glass makers, even the beggars guild. So again, the space of the Maidan being that kind of a public space for all sorts of performances activated through these processionals and calendrical events and so forth.
Let me interject, Suzanne, because we really enjoyed the fascinating vignettes that you brought up about the different histories and stories about Maidan. I guess we are running a bit out of time. We have about 14 minutes to have a conversation and get questions from our people. So let me start with a question that I have myself. So I mean, like you talked about, and it was sort of like implicit all the way that we have this very important and potent presence of bazaar in the everyday life. And its presence in the urban space is pretty much tangible for any person who has been to Islamic world. And you did a fantastic job of bringing out and piecing together different vignettes and mostly focused on Isfahan and Iran. Why do you think the notion of Maidan is not in currency in the disciplinary language or memory of architecture?
I'm not sure. You mean as in contemporary?
Yeah, I mean, like
architecture?
this is like more question of epistemology. Yeah, I mean, because mostly when the spaces that are resembling Maidan are being reduced to plaza, or the way yourself talk about it, they've been sort of like reduced to terminologies that are more current in European architecture, and they have that sort of lineage in them. But we are not using Maidan as often as it should, as it present in the everyday life in the contemporary Middle East, or even historically.
Yeah, I think that is very much related to the sort of the dominant paradigms of architectural history, art history, which derived uh, from European models and promote European models. That in order to make it known to the public beyond, let's say, Cairo or Tehran or Istanbul, to use a term that is familiar across European languages seems to me to be part of the problem. This is not unlike, for instance, the problem of the language that is used for art historical purposes in looking at, say, Persian painting, for which the language of art history developed for Renaissance and European arts is completely inadequate, actually. So I mean, there are various other political reasons of contemporary preference for looking, for instance, for inspiration at the architects of today rather than local, but that's not universal either. There are a lot of architects, in my view, and architectural historians who do look at this material in the Middle East in general, and in Iran certainly, with a very sharp eye fixed onto these histories.
Mm-hmm. And I was also wondering, because I was reading the chapter that you wrote and sort of like covered on the other cities, the other cases in Kerman and Farhabad. And with your own perspective on history, I was wondering how the Maidan has evolved, how the form and function has evolved, especially I'm thinking of contemporary Iran. Is it the functions have been limited or more regulated, or is it quite the same?
It's certainly in the contemporary context, the Maidans have been laid out more in with relevance to boulevards and major street formations, grid work, and so forth, rather than the kinds of urban planning that inspired earlier periods. The Safavid period in particular is very important in understanding that this notion of an urban design, premeditated urban design with a Maidan at its center with all these various functions was extensively practiced, that it also carries through in the Qajar period. But in the Pahlavi era, with this transformation of the city of Tehran, for instance, if you look at Maidans in the northern parts of the city, where the Pahlavi period constructions take place, the picture is completely different there. And that you have not a square, but a roundabout, essentially, as an idea that dominates in many of these. This is truly a case of how European inspired modernization, if you will, in scare quotes, has taken root in these places. I lived in Maadi in Cairo, right next to Maidan and Nahda. And the Maidan was a roundabout, and Maadi was laid out by the British in Egypt. And so the shape of these cities as they developed in their modernizing exercises, takes a whole different direction.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Oh, Samin, do you mind if I come in here?
Yeah, sure, please. Go on.
First of all, Suzanne, this was so interesting. I really enjoyed it. And sorry that we prematurely cut you off, but we were sort of conscious of time. But it was really fascinating. And I loved looking, at those images and the transformations and sort of looking at, those spaces comparatively. I think that's such an important lens. So I'm wondering, I'm very much interested in gender issues. And I'm very much sort of interested how public spaces are gendered.
Yeah.
And the kind of dialectic between the actual physical space. So that's kind of, I guess, where you were sort of focusing on the physical space, but how that is in dialectic with the social space.
Right.
And actually next week, interestingly, we have a colleague who will be speaking about women of the Maidan and speaking about, of course, the revolutionary, the protest in Cairo.
Oh, in Cairo.
Yeah. So I was wondering, but of course we can speak about, women and gender and the various Maidans and Midans in many different contexts. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the way that public spaces, particularly these Maidans, how they're gendered and how they might transform over time.
That's a really important and really interesting question, which historically we don't have as much information, for instance, to speak of the gendered space of the Maidan. We do know that there is commerce that is led by women, but we don't quite know that they are fixed in the Maidan, for instance, the way commerce otherwise is, in other words, in the male sort of dominated space of the Maidan. Maidan of Isfahan is one of two public spaces, the other one being the Chahar Bagh promenade. And in the Chahar Bagh, we know that for women, there were days that the whole Chahar Bagh would be made what they call the Quruq. It would be saved from all men entering. And there you would have women also as merchants and craftspeople and so forth. So that aspect is much harder to really pinpoint with any historical depth, to be very precise about it. The inner world of women is better understood. My colleague Catherine Babayan has worked on aspects of the private lives of women, but the public space is more opaque in that regard. In its certainly in its transformations in modern cities, that's a very different matter. I remember when in the Tahrir Square uprisings, I called a friend, an artist, Huda Lutfi, and she was right in the middle of Tahrir Square and answered the phone. I just wanted to know where she is, how she's doing, and there she was. And we know women were hugely important, as they were in the 2009 events, as they were in the revolution in Iran. I was a student at the time, and I vividly remember the role women played in these public spaces in relation to the revolution, actually. The earlier periods are different. And what is so interesting is that these public spaces, these Maidans or Midans, are not places necessarily of commerce, especially. They are more traffic sort of spaces. Tahrir Square is a great example. You don't go there to stroll about and hang out and have a picnic the way you do in Isfahan's Maidan, It's a place you pass through as fast as you can, right? So it is the Maidan, Jale Maidan, the old days, or any of the Maidans in Tehran, in this modern sort of urban development. And I think that is the key here, that the Maidans, these public spaces, are very differently articulated in the modern cities. They are not the kinds of places that provide with intimate spaces, with security, for instance, to roam about, to have a stroll or to sit around and have a coffee and so forth. That's not the role of those squares as far as I know them, but it was in the old ones.
Thanks so much, Susan. Samin, I think we'll probably have time for one more question if you wanted to ask your final question. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of questions, but I don't know how much time we have. 2 minutes?
I think we have time for one question. Yeah, we can go like a few minutes over, a couple of minutes over.
So yeah, I mean, I would be interested to know about the evolution of Maidans, if you would be able to talk about from like different periods, like at least from Pahlavi or a contemporary more during the Islamic Republic, if that's possible at all.
Yeah, I don't think I'm qualified to do that, and it is a big project. I agree.
Yeah,
modern urbanization is a very different consideration. I would I don't know who has worked on the Maidan in particular, but there are a number of scholars, Iranian scholars, who are very interested in this subject.
Yeah, it's a very understudied subject to me. When I was teaching this semester a course on Tehran, I figured out we don't have that much terminologies that focus on our native architectural elements. That's why I brought up that.
Yeah, actually, yeah, you're right. But I think people like Talin Garagor have worked on this material extensively, so it might be useful to go back and look at some of those studies.
Yeah, I mean, we actually covered and read Talin Garagor's work on Shahyad landmark, Azadi Square. So this was one of the topics that students of my class are pretty much very familiar, and they were looking forward to this presentation to think about Isfahan and different case studies.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think unfortunately we've run out of time. Thanks so much, Susan. This was really, really interesting and enlightening. I certainly enjoyed it a great deal. I'm glad that we'll be able to share this also beyond today. We'll have a recording on our website. Thanks so much, Samin, for organizing this, and obviously always many thanks to Barbara Oberkötter. Yeah, thanks to all of you who joined us today.